Hey guys, today I'm back in Scrap Mechanic and I want to try making a semi-realistic car. Now I made a few engines in the past that sort of worked, but in this video I want to try using thrusters since they have a lot more power and they give the right kind of vibe I'm going for. So let's get right into it. So just loading into the sandbox here, and the first thing I do is just build up a basic platform on top of the lift. Now I have a bad habit of starting projects right on the ground, and that means I can't remove them later. So I actually remembered this time, and after I did that, I put a thruster right on this bar, and you see that there's a bearing. And as I try to toggle a thruster, I'm able to spin it up, and theoretically this would work to power a wheel, but it just doesn't feel right. It's not really realistic this way. So to start working on an actual engine, my first thought here was to drop a block straight on the thruster and see if the thruster would fling it away. And unfortunately, that didn't happen at all. Now it's totally fine. I could just use the thrusters straight on the pistons, but it would have been a little more space efficient if I could have used the thrusters to push the pistons rather than have them on the piston themselves. And I also experimented a bit with hitting blocks with the thrusters, but it seemed to be really chaotic and unpredictable, and it seemed like the best way to go was definitely just put the thrusters right on the pistons. Now as for what type of engine I'm going for here, I want to make a boxer engine, and it's actually for a few reasons. The first one is that it's highly requested, but also I kind of need it here because in a boxer engine you have two pistons that are always directly opposing each other. Now on the left side you'll see I have a V engine, and this one isn't going to work as well because by the arrows you'll notice that there's actually going to be twisting in the crankshaft, and also it's going to push me forward and back, which means the car is going to vibrate, and it's just not going to be that good. The boxer on the right hand side though will always cancel itself out, meaning I just get torque. Now to start building this, I just put up a basic shaft with a bearing on it. After that, I just put down a few more blocks and a couple more bearings, and I had my first and second cranks here. Now I'm just going for two pistons right now, and I'll add on the second two later. But you see as I hit the crankshaft here, it seems to rotate pretty well, and there's two blocks in the middle that don't rotate at all, and those are the ones I'm going to attach the pistons to. So that working well, I ended up putting one of the arms to the pistons here. After that, I just completely surrounded it with the mesh block. Now the mesh block has really low friction, so it should allow things to slide past it, but I noticed that it wasn't rotating at all, and I forgot that you can't completely encapsulate the piston, or else it just doesn't want to work. So I had to create a bigger slot for it, but I didn't want the piston to violently move up and down as the thruster applies force to it. So what I ended up doing here is adding in a little bit of a saddle for it, and the saddle is going to allow the piston shaft to go side to side a little bit, but it should hold it down. And with that done, it actually did seem to push it reasonably well, but it also seemed to bottom out, and it wouldn't allow it to fully rotate. So to get it to fully rotate, I moved that cradle a little bit further back. After that, it rotates really well here, and the piston isn't able to move up and down at all more than it's supposed to, so this is exactly what I need. And with that done, I pretty much just did a mirror copy of the exact same thing, and once that was done, I also could power them using the same button. Now that's really convenient for timings, because that means I don't need to have separate timings for one side or the other, so they just turn on at the same time, and it seems to work pretty well here. Now if that good, I ended up just making the design a little bit more friendly so that I can add a second set of these on here. Now I needed a second set here so it could apply power when the first set of pistons isn't applying power, but attaching them was very difficult. I tried using some different bearings and stuff, but every time I tried this, it seemed to be really weak, and I got really weird motion out of this. Now after moving a few blocks around, I actually had the opposite problem here. As I tried to power the thrusters, they just wouldn't move at all. They completely were binding up, and nothing was happening at all. Now I could get it so that one side worked and the other side worked, but connecting them together was for some reason really difficult. Now I tried adding some extra blocks into the crankshaft to make it a bit more rigid, and this in theory would work, but the pistons end up binding on it and it won't let it fully rotate around. So after quite a bit of testing, I eventually realized I was going to need to use pistons here. Now pistons have no collision in the middle of them, so it's really good for being able to move around this middle shaft, but I didn't really love using them because it was slightly unrealistic. The thing is though, in a real car, the middle of the bearing would have the shaft going straight through it in effect, but I can't really do that in this game, so the only real way for me to do this is have those pistons where it can clip right through it. Now the pistons aren't great either because they are a little weak, and you'll see later it creates a little bit of slop that makes it very difficult to get everything tuned right. But after getting everything in here, you'll notice as I hit the button, the pistons extend and they hopefully will grab right onto the crankshaft. After they do that, I'm able to hit the button and all of the pistons go at once. Now the pistons on both sides are actually going at the exact same time, which isn't what I want. I want one side to be pushing in while the other one's pushing out, but at least for now, it seems to be pretty good. Now I put a few pistons on the ground here, and these are gonna allow me to rotate the second part of the crankshaft up a little bit to get it slightly out of phase. And you'll notice now, as one piston goes, the other one's a little bit ahead of it in its cycle, so that should allow me to apply power a little more evenly. Now, with the engine looking pretty good here, I wanted it to run automatically, and I added in a sensor here to do that. And starting out, the sensor seemed to be blocking it from working, but it shouldn't have done that. So I went around for a little while and ended up fixing some extra problems I had, and now it seems to be fine. The sensor is detecting the thruster straight in front of it, and this is good, but I noticed the sensor is turning on a little bit too soon. Now the purpose of this specific sensor is to turn off the thruster when it gets too close to the end. So if it switches on too early, it's going to be switching off the thruster a little too early, and I'm losing quite a bit of power. So I moved the sensor over to the side, and this seemed to look a little bit better, but I couldn't quite get it to switch on at the right time here. So in order to do that, I added on a bearing, and once I did that, I put it in the controller, and I told it to rotate 15 degrees. This gives it a slight curve and allows the sensor to just barely see the thruster when I want it to. With that done, I actually had to move over the thruster a little bit, and finally here, it seemed to turn on at just the right time. It's exactly when it comes right into view. And in order to turn on the thruster, I was gonna need another sensor as well, so I just put that on the same arm, and this seemed to look pretty good at first, but I noticed I was having a really hard time detecting it right. So what I ended up doing was using a center column like this, and this allows it to detect the thruster at just the right time. And you can see here it flashes on and off as it detects it, so that should work pretty well for turning it on. Now in order to get this system to work, I was gonna need to add in a latch. Now the specific latch is an SR latch, and the idea is that the first sensor is gonna turn on the latch, second sensor is gonna turn it off. And at first, things seemed to not be working out so well. It was sort of just acting weird, but eventually it seemed to sort of get its act together here. So with that first latch working really well, I wanted to add in a second one here. Now I technically could have just used one latch and then inverted the output for these pistons, but it makes it a little bit better in terms of timings to have a dedicated latch for this and also dedicated sensors. Now with that done, I also added another piston, and what this one does is when I flip a switch, it pushes down and it rotates the crankshaft into position. I had this before, but this is just a slightly less annoying version of that. Now with that done, giving it a test here, and it seems to work pretty well, honestly. It seems to rotate just fine, and at this point, I didn't really notice any hesitation or any problems with this at all. So I ended up just letting it sit here for like maybe a few minutes, and it seemed to work just fine. I had no problems at all. There's no issues with it stalling, so I was really happy with the performance. So with that looking good, I added on some wheels here, and it was time for me to get this on a car. Now, of course, the engine works just fine on wheels, but getting it connected to a wheel is the tricky part. So after a little bit of looking around, I ended up deciding here I was gonna need to use more pistons, and I could attach the wheel to the end of these pistons here. After I had that done, just had to have the pistons expand out, and once they did that, they locked onto the wheel, and now the wheel's rotating, and it seems to go at a pretty constant rate, which surprised me. I thought it'd be a lot more finicky than that. But adding in a wheel to the bottom was not gonna work so well, because I need a way to link these. Now I could use some sort of gearing system, but the issue with gears is that I'm gonna have a lot of inefficiencies, especially in this game. So in order to fix that, I wanted to try using some sort of 4-bar linkage here. Now testing out this first linkage system actually seemed to be much better than I thought. I was able to transfer rotation to the bottom, but getting the wheel on it was a little more tricky, and as soon as it hit the ground, it seemed to just stall out. So I actually started out by putting the wheel as far into the car as possible, and I added a link on the outside of that. Now hitting it around just seemed to stop working entirely. So I added a thruster onto the back here, and this thruster's entire job is to act basically just as a starter motor, but it seemed to not work so well, and I realized part of the problem was that the engine was not really spinning up correctly anymore. So I ended up deleting what I had, and I tried adding in a second link. Now the second link should improve stability a bit, and I was thinking maybe this was part of the problem. So I ended up adding that in here, and after I got that all in place, I tried giving it a shot, but it still didn't seem to want to work. So I extended out these pistons again, and after I did that, I tried adding in a third link. Now I was gonna need 3 links anyway, so it didn't really bother me if this wasn't the problem. And the reason I need 3 links is that at any point in the rotation, I can't have 2 of the arms perfectly overlap. If that happens, that means that they're able to kink, and the whole system's gonna break. But with 3 links, they'll never perfectly overlap, and that should solve my problem. But when I let it run here, it started off kind of slow, and starting off slow is fine, because the engine needs a bit of time to build up speed, but it just kind of stopped at some point. And that was definitely weird. That just shouldn't really happen at all. So I tried upping the force of some of these thrusters, but the one thruster really did not seem to like that. And adding in a thruster into the back here, it seemed to get the engine to spin up, but that's when I noticed a big problem. The thruster on the left side is never turning off, and I have no idea why, because it was working fine before, and I was gonna fix it, but then I fell off the car, and I couldn't catch back up to it, so I actually had to leave the game and come back in to make sure it would shut all the thrusters off. And once I finally got back in, got over to the car, I ended up lifting it up and just put it on some stilts here, and I just wanted to make sure I knew what the problem was. And the problem was definitely that that thruster just wasn't shutting off. And I went through all the logic and everything seemed to be fine, so I just ended up rebuilding it because I figured maybe something went wrong somewhere. After I did that, I hit the wheel and everything seemed to work again. So I have no idea what went wrong there, but I guess it's fine now. So after that, I just added on some wheels and tried to give it another shot. And starting out, it seemed to be pretty good. Now, it was definitely slowing down here, but it was able to keep itself going for quite a while, and whenever the thrusters would engage, I'd clearly get a speed boost. So I was really happy about that, and I ended up maxing out the speed of all these thrusters as much as I possibly could, and the engine, while it was struggling a little bit, was moving pretty well. Now, I added in a small delay over on the second set of pistons, and the only reason I did this is because I noticed it was turning off a little bit early. So giving it a bit more time to push was helping it a lot more, and the top speed here was just slightly improved. Now, with the engine looking good, the next thing I want to do is extend out the back of the car and start doing some tests with gears. Now, there aren't any gears in the game, so you kind of have to make them. I tried this before, but they can be quite tricky to make. This time though, I wanted to try using pipes because they seem to be a little bit better. Now, trying to mesh these two gears here at first didn't work out so well, so I'd move them a bit closer, but once I did that, they actually did seem to mesh nicely. Now, just having gears like this isn't what I want though, because if I was gonna make a real transmission or something like that, I was going to need to have some sort of gear ratio, which means one gear has to be bigger than the other one. And trying that out here at first just didn't seem to be that good. It would stop a lot, and it just did not really want to mesh properly. Now, my next idea here was to actually double up the smaller gear, and once I did that, that was gonna allow me to use 4 teeth on the top and bottom of the second gear, which means that it should mesh a little bit better. And this gear pair was a lot better than the other one, but it was still not that great. It would bind up quite often, and the amount of force required to move these around was quite high. It seemed like the majority of the energy I'm dumping into this was just going into rotating it, and very little was actually going to be able to be used on the output. But even so, I still wanted to try putting this on the output and at least giving it a shot here. Now, the other advantage is it's going to give me a reverse gear, which was sort of the main thing I wanted anyway, but if I could get something to go a bit faster as well, that would have been nice. Now, I had to use another couple pistons here to attach this on right, and after I got that all right, it seemed to rotate just fine. So with that done, I added in a gear here, and with that, I wanted to add in a wheel. Now, you'll see this is a lot more simple than the other side, because having this gearing system doesn't require me to have all those extra pistons and all those linkages, so it should line up a lot better. Now, I tried starting this up, and it just didn't seem to want to move, and hitting the side of the gears helped, but you'll notice the gears are skipping a lot here, and they just aren't really that effectively transferring power. So as a last-ditch effort, I tried attaching pipes directly to the wheel, and these seem to space quite nicely, but they're a little far apart, and trying to get this to work means there's a lot of slop in the mechanism. And in fact, I have to turn on this thruster to maximum force just to push the car at all, but it doesn't seem to work at all. So I ended up getting rid of the gearing system entirely, and to get it to go in reverse, my next thought was to do it purely with logic. Now, ideally what I would do is just reverse my 2 sensors, so instead of the front one turning it off, it'll turn it on, and instead of the back one turning it on, it'll turn it off. And by doing that, I was kind of thinking it would turn it in reverse. Now, I wasn't thinking very hard here, because as soon as I put on the thruster, I noticed something kind of interesting. It didn't seem to work at all. In fact, the pistons seemed to be pushing in the opposite direction that I wanted them to. They were always opposing the direction of motion, rather than moving the car in reverse. So my next thought here was maybe I put the thruster on the wrong side, so I ended up moving it to the other side, and it also didn't seem to work. It had the exact same problem. I actually don't need to change the logic at all for it to go in reverse. All I need to do is tweak the position of some of the sensors, and once I do that, it should just literally work in reverse already. So with that system looking good, I wanted to try adding in steering. And to do that, I am adding in an engine here, but I'm not going to use it for any sort of power at all. After I attach it to the seat here, you'll see I'm able to spin this block side to side, and I'll use this to rotate a pinion around, so I'm able to use rack and pinion steering here. Now, I started making the basis of a pinion like this, and to start getting the steering to work, I ended up attaching it to wheels like this. After that, I'm adding in some pipes here to act as gear teeth, and as I hit this side to side, it should allow the wheels to slightly rotate, and that'll be my steering mechanism. You'll see here as I hit it with the sledgehammer, it does rotate the wheels, so this should work. Now, in order to get the pinion to work right, I had to delete half of the teeth on the rack, and once I did that, it started to rotate it, and it actually was rotating the wheels, which was great, but there's a lot of slop in the mechanism. There's so much that I'd pretty much be able to go from all the way turning to the left to the right, and the mechanism would have no say over that. Then hopefully fix that, I tried getting rid of the rack and pinion and just using a wheel to directly rotate against the rack, but that didn't seem to work. And using a saw blade also didn't seem to touch it. And finally here, the fuel tank also didn't seem to work. So with all that kind of out of the way, I needed to use a different rack and pinion system, and this one seemed to be a lot better. Putting these blocks straight on the tire means that they touch these pipes really well, and they grab onto them pretty tightly here. Now, I was hoping I could get it a little bit tighter, so I replaced the really small pipes for some of of these larger ones like this. But this didn't seem to work, and I tried to move it side to side, it completely binded up. So finally, I ended up replacing the blocks with some of these angled pieces of iron, and that seemed to give me some of the smoothest movement possible. And testing it out here just by turning on the thrusters, it actually was able to steer here, so it seemed pretty good. And now with the steering done, all that's left to do is just clean up the design a little bit. And I started out just by having those wheel pieces automatically extend out. After that, I put the driver's seat in a slightly better spot, and I connected it up to all of the controls I need. Now this involves the reverse control, the starters in both directions, and the extra control that turns on the engine. And with all that done, it was time to give it a shot here, and starting out, it was a little rough, but once I turned on that starter motor, it seemed to be fine, and it kind of got on its way. Now turning to the right, super great, worked awesome, didn't have any problems at all. But as soon as I tried to turn to the left here, I had major problems, and I realized what the problem was here. As I try to turn to the left, the wheel that powers everything has to spin faster in order to keep the same speed, which means that as I try to turn it, it loads the engine harder, and that causes it to stall sometimes. So my new solution was to pull in the wheel as much as I possibly could, and I got it in an extra like 4 or 5 blocks. And once I did that, it not only looked a little bit better, it seemed to drive quite a bit better as well. Now I'm able to turn to the left here, and it seems to be fine. In this test as well, I'm able to turn, and it ended up seemingly stalling, but it's actually because I turned it in reverse here, and again, it seemed to be perfectly fine. And finally here, I just have a few more tests to show you. So guys, thanks for watching. I was looking for a project to do in Scrap Mechanic for quite a while now, and I'm glad I found something that seemed pretty fun. So if you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them down below. Subscribe if you want to see more content like this, and otherwise, till next time.